Thank you for attending the afternoon session after lunch. Great to see some people actually arrived. We have the honor this afternoon of talking to you about nature-positive mining, and to set the context, I'd like to reflect on a quote from the CEO of ICMM, Rohitesh Dhawan, Haley's boss. I had the honor of attending the Financial Times Live Mining Summit a month or so ago, and he opened the proceedings and was discussing the energy transition and the role of mining in the energy transition. And he posed 3 questions which I think set the context very well for our conversation today. His questions were, how much should we mine? Where should we mine? And how should we extract these critical minerals? And his answers were simple but resonate and have significant impact for the industry and actually for society as a whole and how we respond to this challenge. And to the question of how much should we mine, his answer was, as much as we need. No more, no less. So make the maximum use of the resource available, but ensure that future generations are able to access what they need. How should we mine? Responsibly or not at all. And Nature Positive very much comes into that realm. And the third answer I thought was very clever. Where should we mine? Here, there, but not everywhere. There are certain places on the planet that are special, they require protection, World Heritage Sites, IUCN Category 1 to 3 protected areas. We need to understand that there are certain places that have that level of protection and need to be protected as such. And we have a responsibility outside of those areas to execute our activities in the best way possible. So joining me today to talk about nature-positive mining and what it means for the mining industry, we've got a panel of distinguished guests. I'm going to start on the far side. We've got Matt Fifield. He comes from Pacific Road Capital. He's had a bit of an exhausting travel, so great to have you here. Thank you, Matt. Next to him, we've got Haley Zip, who's from the ICMM. She's a Director for Environment. We have Frank Voorhuis, who comes from Earthmind, and he's also working in partnership, as you'll discover, with Philip Avaris to my right, who's from Horizonte Minerals, and in between them is Duncan Pessett from Barrick Gold. So we'll start off with a discussion between us and some questions, and then open the floor if anyone would like to contribute to the conversation. So I'm going to start with Haley. As a member of, as ICMM, you guys have this fantastic oversight and perspective of the entire industry. So what is your view of nature positive? What does it mean for the mining industry? And can mining be nature positive?
Great question, Teresa, and thanks for that challenging question. I think there's quite a few different definitions around what nature positive is, so I'm going to just try and give you a little bit of a nutshell in terms of our take on that. But ultimately, nature positive is a bold, ambitious global goal around halting biodiversity loss by 2030 against the 2020 baseline. And so, in essence, that's really looking at a state of global nature that is more healthy, abundant, and resilient tomorrow than what we have today. And I imagine that the wheels are turning and you're thinking, okay, nature positive, mining, are those comfortable bedfellows? And aren't we as an industry really in the business of breaking ground? And the answer to that is yes, we are, but we've also got so much that we can contribute in terms of a nature positive future. A little known fact about our industry is that of the land that we own, manage or lease, it's usually somewhere around 5% that we actually do mining operations within that land, and so you have a huge amount of land and water that we steward and that we can really leverage for nature gains. In addition, we've got decades of experience in terms of restoration science, monitoring and managing biodiversity, so there's a lot that we can bring to the table. And over the last 18 months, we've had some really fascinating dialogue both with our member companies in terms of the nature practitioners that we work with on a day-to-day level, but also external experts in trying to really understand what nature positive looks like for mining. And I wanted to share with you the 3 core principles that are at the heart of what nature positive action looks like for our sector. One is around urgency. We need to act for nature today. We're in the industry of long life assets, large scale projects. Taking 5 years to get to action is just simply going to be too late. The second point is around collaboration. No one actor can deliver nature positive on their own. It's something that we need to embrace as a whole of society approach, and mining can and must play a fundamental role in delivering nature positive outcomes. And then finally, it needs to be transformational. We have really significant influence from our direct operations out across our landscapes in which we operate in and throughout the value chains that we're part of. So we need to be really innovative and think about what our influence within that kind of broader spheres of influence can look like. And I would love to just give you a quick vignette of what this could look like. I'm missing a clicker, so I'm not sure whether I'm able to get to my slides.
Do you want to get it? Thanks.
It's not on the lectern, though.
Oh, here it comes.
Oh, lovely.
You can give it to Hayley. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
There we go.
So just here in front of you, this is an example of nature positive or conservation action at scale. It's the Vale Carajás concession, which mining takes place in the Amazon. So you can see those little red areas are where the mining operations are actually at. But you can also see that over the course of 40 odd years, massive scale deforestation has taken place all around the mine site, and that's largely due to pastoral and agricultural uses of the land. What's really interesting here is how Vale has managed to partner with government, but also with local indigenous communities to conserve over 411,000 hectares. And if you look at that kind of forest degrading over time, it's really only those areas that have come under protection through those partnerships that are remaining as intact forest. So if you just take that as one example, one company and a number of different collaborations, you can imagine that writ large at scale across the industry, we have so much opportunity around restoration, conservation, creating conservation corridors. And I'd like to leave you with that just moment of inspiration in terms of what this could look like as we dive into the panel to discuss what it could look like on the ground from some of my fellow panelists.
Thanks, Hayley.
Shall I pass this on to you?
Right, so no surprise, Philip is up next. So thinking of Brazil and Horizonte's activities, what is your contribution to Nature Positive? What are you doing in Horizonte as part of your contribution to Nature Positive mining?
Okay, thanks very much. Actually, our operations are in this same area that's shown in this GIF, so I think that's a bit of helpful context. But of course, our operation hasn't been there since 1984, as Vale has. So how do we take a situation that is more on the, kind of deforested end of the scale and turn that into a nature positive kind of context? So again, with Horizonte, we've been working collaboratively with a number of partners. We're a development company at this stage, so it's really the beginning of how we would put these systems and processes into place. So we're working with our stakeholder communities, with biodiversity experts, and also educators and researchers at universities who have a lot of knowledge. And look, we've also got industry partners like the Vale Foundation who are also there and willing to support us. So we're taking quite detailed environmental impact assessments, but we're building on that because we need more information if we want to go to nature positive. And so what we're doing now is critical habitat assessments for our operations, ecosystem services assessments in the kind of regional context that we operate in, and then cumulative impact assessments, because we also need to understand that where we displace people, those people will look elsewhere for ecosystem services to provide their livelihoods, and we have to understand what impact that will have in a kind of broader regional context. And it's actually through this process that we're able to understand, we'll talk a bit more about the TNFDs later on, it's through this process that we're understanding not just the impacts and the dependencies, but also the opportunities that our presence in this community, in this region, will be able to have in terms of nature and nature-based solutions in the future. And The kind of practical output of this is a biodiversity action plan, and now our biodiversity strategic action plan, which talks about the longer term time frame in which we're going to deliver these biodiversity actions. Because unlike some of the other elements of environmental management, this is an action plan that's going to continue to evolve with time, because the surrounding context is also evolving with time. We're not sitting in a static picture. And so it's really important that we're continuing to feed that information in to update our strategies. A few visuals for you. So this is where our operation is, and I'm going to talk quite tactical now about how do we actually take these concepts and make them real on the ground. So this is where our operations are. You can see the kind of patchwork quilt of agriculture that exists in our operating locale. Where we've got these larger remnant forest or vegetated areas rather, this is because of the Brazilian law that requires the preservation of legal reserve areas. So these areas are required by the farm owners to be preserved for biodiversity. That doesn't mean that they're not using these areas, but it's much more difficult for people to actually do deforestation in these areas. And you can see the red blocks here are where our pits and waste dump complexes are going to be, and the kind of light orange and black is where the processing facility is in construction now. So I want to draw your attention to this area that's Pecka Zero and Billington to highlight some examples. In the early days when the feasibility study was put together, you can see the inset there. Anybody here from a mining background? We all understand that when a feasibility study is done, sometimes people aren't there on the ground necessarily considering the realities of the situation in the area. So when the original mine plan was developed for our operations, pits and waste dumps were just literally put as close together as they could be. As we evolved our knowledge in the location, you can see, sorry, I need to kind of turn around, make sure I point at the right picture. You can see over here, we identified an area of kanga, which is critical habitat in our location. That came from our critical habitat assessment. So we were able to modify our operation to avoid that area of kanga, which you can see in the 2018 picture. And then now to 2023 to highlight our further kind of development of opportunities. We've also looked at this entire area of forest here, which is close to 50 hectares. And it's required some work from the mining guys, but they've completely redesigned the waste dump complex and the stockpile situation to minimise the footprint. And we did that through a process of cost-benefit analysis to justify it in the mining context. What would it actually cost us to clear these 50 hectares of forest? So we can put a value to this. This is a really important way of getting our message across within the business. And it was far, far more affordable to actually avoid the forest, given our commitment to net positive, than it would be to actually disturb this forest. So we've now completely redesigned this part of the operation to avoid having impact to this area, which is just the first of the opportunities that we've identified through our biodiversity strategic action plan.
And so you're not doing this work alone?
No.
You are working with various stakeholders, with the communities, and also with Frank and his team. So Frank, what is your perspective on the project? What's been Earthmine's involvement? Do you think Horizonte is on the right track?
So what I've been involved with is I'm part of a team that does the audit of your environmental and social management plans, assessments, and so on. And this is really interesting to be part of. So we're paid through the company, but we're not reporting to the company, and we're actually more closely reporting to the lenders. So this is tied up with the way the lenders use the IFC performance standards. And the first comment is that those standards are really, really, really important because they give everybody something to work against. So we find ourselves as reviewers, we say auditor, but we also say reviewers and advisors. We're as much using the standards to work with the company to think through issues like the one you just gave. oh, look at that forest. Can we make a plan to do this a little bit differently? And then also that we provide assurance to the lenders and others and to government officials that this is being done. And so you talk about partnership, that's a really key part of this process, is to have some type of a standard that people have signed up to, and to have the ability to have that independent voice that can both ensure, if you will, positive outcomes and assure stakeholders that those outcomes are taking place. Now, if you look at the IFC standard in the context of what we're talking about here, it was very much a standard to minimize the risk of the project on environmental and social terms, and if you want to be cynical, just the risk to the investors, that they don't have egg on their face and they've lent money to a project that's gone south. In the biodiversity bit of it, the main focus is not net positive, but nature positive, but nature neutral, if you will. No net loss. But if it's a critical habitat, you should have a net positive impact, and that's been embedded for many, many years now. So all we're really doing is taking the IFC standards and pushing them a bit further and saying the whole project should contribute and have a net positive impact on nature, which I think is very doable. And then the final point in that, and it's good you brought up the ecosystem services, it's not about nature in isolation, it's that interrelationship between nature and the communities and how those resources are used that's really important. So then you end up with, you're not just talking about the project, but how the project fits into the broader social and environmental landscape. And that's one of the things that Horizonte Minerals is very keen about, that they're a positive player in the landscape, not just doing their own thing in a good way, but doing it in a broader part as a good corporate citizen of the whole area.
Super, thanks, Frank. So, Duncan, in Barrick's world, you operate across many geographies and you've got multiple sites. What does nature positive look like for each of those sites? Is it the same, or how do you manage and how do you ensure that these sites are working towards being nature positive?
Yeah, so Barrick's business model and with it our sustainability strategy, we empower our site teams to manage their business on the ground where the asset is. Just like they need to manage the ore body or processing, they equally need to manage their sustainability aspects, whether it be community relations, biodiversity, water, or everything that ties up into what is considered in the natural landscape. We cannot manage mines thousands of kilometers away from a head office. So we set the policies, we set the governance structures, we set the commitments, but then we empower those teams to apply principles and manage their business to meet those commitments within that governance framework. So that really allows certain flexibility at an asset level that responds to their context, to their nuances of their environment, their communities, and they set those roadmaps and projects to enable themselves to meet those commitments. So I think that's a very important part of how we manage it. We can maintain that oversight at a corporate level, but really the road hits it on the ground where the asset is, and that's a priority for us. So within our nature positive contributions and what we're doing at a landscape level, it's really the fundamental targets that we set and how we reach those within that. So whether it be a biodiversity, no net loss commitment and the projects to achieve that, whether it be socioeconomic development and alternative livelihoods and how the community interacts with their ecosystem services, to how we manage water quality, quantity. So there's really fundamental building blocks that each site is responsible for doing. What that looks like is very contextual for that site.
And obviously that context changes over time, and the asset being present in that context, they're the best place to understand this evolving context that Philippa was talking about earlier on.
Absolutely. As an asset starts and people seek jobs or opportunities, or you improve services and infrastructure, you get population influx, and again that creates a change in the landscape and how people are interacting with their environment. So those changes and those plans are constantly evolving through an asset's life, into closure planning, beyond closure. It's always a constant review and flexibility to ensure it's up to date and meeting those expectations.
So Matt, we heard in Frank's conversation around investors and investors wanting to avoid having egg on their face. What is your perspective on mining and being nature positive?
Sure. So Pacific Road Capital, we're a mining private equity group. We can be anything from a small shareholder in a large company through to sometimes the only shareholder in a company. And so there's a little bit of a convergence between, say, some of the thoughts here of where a mining company is coming from, and then also just, our principal job, if you think of an investor's job, is to take $1 and hopefully turn it into 2 and have it avoid turning into 10 cents. And so in that single statement, though, there's a lot of ways that you can go about trying to make money and avoid losing money. And I would say that to some of what Frank was saying in terms of IFC, there's signing up to protocols that is an expression of, say, negative power, which is to say, follow this guideline or else we won't, there's a chain of events that will happen, and that's roughly equated to the stick of it all. And then what we actually spend a lot of time thinking about, because the value aligns with who we are, but also is we think a lot about what's the carrot. And nature positive is one of those really, it's a very fast evolving field. The companies that we generally are investing in where we have substantial influence are smaller single asset companies, sometimes development stage, sometimes one operation looking at 2. What we have found across this journey is that you hire better people that are more engaged with what you're doing. You have access to customers and capital bases, and ultimately would be acquirers and valuations and investors, all of which create a strategic advantage when you're spending time in the zone thinking about how do we do better. And there's so many different pieces of this because our investee companies control large swaths of land and have so much data, just so much data, that the starting point of how do we measure a baseline and then how do we improve on that it's a great starting point. Then when you bring it up to a board level, it's how do we design compensation schemes or group targets that are going to be mutual gain, that are aligned with how you build on these different things. But I think ultimately, rather than just negative power of an investor saying we won't give you money if you don't do this, which is of course topical for everybody that's looking for money, the other side of it is the firm belief that there is strategic advantage in that. And some of the strategic advantage, yes, is risk avoidance, but the rest of it is kind of an intangible around the way that you do things. We've seen this play out. For example, one of our investee companies, it actually ends up being little things that are created on site, right? So when we looked at our reclamation obligations on a mineral sands mine in Kenya that we're a large shareholder in, you have to reclaim. So we have progressive reclamation. That's check. That's a nice thing. People see that you're taking care of what you're disturbing, and that's kind of value aligned. But then rather than being monoculture, the idea then became, let's create a seed bank and a biodiversity. We call it the magical forest, but it's basically all of the threatened and endangered fauna and flora that then begets different environments that create an enhanced biodiversity. And so it's the largest of its kind in Southern Africa in terms of a dedicated endangered species nursery. But it all started with a simple idea of how do we take this a little bit better. So we're finding this to be a very fruitful field as we talk to management teams, as we evaluate investments, not only the risk avoidance side, and are we aligned with some of the ways to avoid that risk, but actually what are some interesting ways that you can engage people on a journey that's about the company that you're building.
So I just want to build on one of those points, because we had in our prep conversation, we were talking about the other benefits to the company, as you've said now, around being nature positive. So I'm going to open it to any of the panelists. What are some of the other benefits you've seen or you expect to see as a result of these aspirations for becoming nature positive? There's one really interesting area that we're finding, if I could just jump in and then I'll defer to the expertise on the panel, is in fact, we're finding that nature positive, of course, in a broader philosophy of stewardship, has incredible alignment with UNDRIP, Indigenous people, traditional owners, First Nations, whatever the word you want, but stakeholders
that look at this in a multi-generational perspective. And so when you, and that can actually create a huge acceleration of social license and or what are we doing here, where somebody can say, okay, we can withstand this amount of disturbance when we're involved in the closure plan, and what does reforestation look like? Very tangible example, we're working in Canada where a typical reforestation program would be monoculture timber, right? And actually, when working with our First Nations partners, now the question is, what's the goal here? Is it habitat for large species? Is it enhancing migratory pathways? Is it increased wetlands? Is it water filtration? So you start to engage around an area that it creates actually a tremendous amount of powerful consensus around mining, what next? And when you move from the yes mining and you get to the what next, the zone of possible agreement expands from being very narrow to actually being quite wide. And so that is, I think, just this tremendous area of acceleration that we're seeing on our side.
Yes, do you want to add?
Yeah, within Horizonte, when we were developing our sustainability strategy, I was really delighted to see that actually the modern day mining engineer, which is not exactly what you'd have expected back when I first started in the industry, they were waiting to be given the mandate to try and look for opportunities like this. I don't think in the industry yet it's really integrated that people are automatically empowered to do that. But as soon as we started talking to our mining team, they were really delighted that they had the opportunity to be able to try and look for opportunities to avoid impact, to be cognizant of what the community's needs were. And it's fair to say that they would give me feedback that was part of what they felt was making a great place to work, to be able to contribute to something. And when we did employee surveys later on in the year, one of the strongest bits of feedback we got was that our employees were really, really pleased with the work that we were doing to contribute to the community. So we had close to 80% of our employees respond to the survey, and over 90% of them said that the thing that made them really proud of what we were doing was our contribution to the environment and the community. So it's going to help you to actually attract and retain good employees as well.
Duncan?
Yeah, just to add to that, those that were here this morning listening to our CEO, Mark Bristow, he's very passionate about making sure that we are bringing the vulnerable and poor of the world along with this journey with us. And that means making sure that the benefits of a mine and an operation are shared with our host countries, with our local communities. Sustainability is integrated. You can't look at certain aspects in isolation and expect them not to be knock-on, whether intended or unintended consequences out there. And the same principles apply with nature. But ultimately, it comes down to making positive contributions in the space through all those aspects, essentially create a better environment for our communities where they live, and our sites are localized. So again, we are drawing on a workforce from those communities. We don't want them, struggling and not having a good life and a good livelihood associated with it, whether it be directly or indirectly in their broader community. So essentially, it comes all the way down to it's your social license to operate, and that's really the crux of having positive and important measures on the environment, both managing impact but seeing where you can have positive change too.
Thank you.
I think,
sorry, Haley.
Sorry, I was just going to add that I think there's also a really fundamental opportunity to change the conversation. So often as mining, we're talking about, where we are not having harm, or we often perceived as potentially quite a negative force within the landscape and within the communities that we operate in. But having a nature positive kind of orientation really allows you to shift that conversation. You're having different conversations upstream with your suppliers, downstream with your customers, in the landscape with the communities in which you're creating new partnerships with. It can be different conversation with investors, and internally we've already heard about the talent kind of attraction part of that, but also just in terms of shoring up resilience for your operations. We all know the kind of scale of change that's coming through climate change, through wildfires, flooding, all of those different kind of aspects that can really destabilize operations. And so having a hook and a strategy for having different conversations internally and for talking about business resilience in a fundamentally different way is also a new way to engage those across the business. So it's all about new and different conversations.
Thank you. Are there any audience members who have burning questions for our panelists?
Can I just make one statement there?
Sure.
I think that that's a really hopeful set of statements that you said, right? If you think about the villainous role that mining generally plays in Hollywood and, popular culture, there's a strong potential for disbelief and eye roll around nature positive, right? Which is you're really just greenwashing yourself and trying to say that you can achieve something that intrinsically isn't true. And I think that is, when you look within the industry, people are actually extremely, and you heard it up and down the panel, people are extremely passionate about this and connect with it as a sense of mission and being. And the external perception is still just likely to be, okay, I'll see it when I believe it. And I think that one of the challenges that we have pan-industry is a lot of these good stories retain people, attract people, are dealt with in the community, but are dismissed by everyone else. And so I just wanted to recognize that your statement saying that it can help move the dial externally. I view that as a hopeful statement. I wanted to appreciate you for having that hope, because but the reality is it's also just a part of where we are as an industry. Is we have to continually try to do better and move that dialogue even in the face of disbelief.
I think it's also about action, right? And so it's being able to show the action that we're taking and also to measure that over time. And the mining and metals industry does have a huge amount of knowledge and expertise in terms of measuring progress on the ground. And it's about applying that and making that visible to others.
Yeah, and I think that the second thing that's really interesting right now that I expect to see happen over the next 5 years will be the downstream pull from consumers. So if you think about whether it's California consumer laws or supplier code of conduct or all of the rest, there's just carbon disclosures. From the downstream side, consumer-facing businesses are looking for materials that can fulfill the material mission within a certain way. Nature positive is not yet a part of that, but it may become one, and that would be transformative when the downstream supplier conduct and relationship with their raw material supply chain trickles back up into, providing access to different supply chain networks, I think.
And Matt, I think you're right that we're going to see that change quite quickly over the next few years, because now that we've got the TNFDs, there's a common framework upon which investors, society can demand the mining industry start to report what we've previously been perceived as covering up because it's too complex. So we're now challenged in a way to take that actually very complex, quite detailed scientific information and turn it into something that is able to be shared and disclosed. And it'll be interesting over the next few years as we see various teams tackle that in different ways before we start to converge at what will become the norm or the standard for how that reporting occurs. So I, for one, am really excited about what that means for the industry as we move forward, because there are a lot of really great stories out there, and there hasn't been a way to talk about that before that wouldn't be perceived as greenwashing. And so I think having these standards, to wrap back to Frank's conversation earlier, from one lens we can look at standards as being the way that we lift up the lowest common denominators, but from other perspective we can look at standards as being things that are adopted by people who want to be leaders. And the standard is the baseline, it is the minimum, it is the hurdle rate. And how can we show that we can perform beyond that and then use those systems to benchmark ourselves with others? And it's through those processes of benchmarking that we actually help to drag other people up. People will often look at a small company like Horizonte and go, hang on, if they can do that, why can't I do that?
Because nature positive is not only for mining. And I think it goes back to Hayley's point right at the beginning, right? This is a societal goal. And so it's a conversation starter across all industries, and as we know, mining touches on everything. Up and down the supply chain, we sort of interact with all sectors of society, all sectors of the economy, and it's a common conversation starter between us. I see Frank wanted to contribute, and then I don't see any hands waving. If you do want to wave your hands, Andrew will bring a microphone and we'll come to you after Frank.
So I think one of the real potentials of changing the narrative to nature positive from sort of no net loss is no net loss sort of says we don't want to leave this place any worse than it was. And it's sort of backward looking and it's sort of technical, where if you go into nature positive, you start to say, well, what do we want this place to look like in the future? And then, and as I'd said earlier, if you link that environment vision with a social vision of what do we want this area of the planet to look like, people and nature, you come up with a way in which you're part of sort of the future of the area, as opposed to just sort of coming and doing your thing and leaving. So it's almost like a sustainable development positive. And in fact, and this is the metrics problem of nature positive, is you may not, every place is different. As you just said, every one of your mining operations, you have to do different things in different places, there's different contexts. But what's going to come out, I think, as this moves forward, is that nature positive is somewhat embedded in what people that live there want to do with the area they live in. And so having that dialogue to say, our operation, when we complete it and are finished with it, what are we leaving for this community? What does the community want? Do they want your area to go back to a cattle ranch? Or do they want it to be something different or whatever? And so I think the change in language changes the focus, which then can be really exciting.
Okay, we've got a question over there.
So first of all, thank you for all your contributions. My name's Joe, I'm a student from the University of Southampton, and I think we can see a few students and young people here today, which is great because it's showing the interest that we have in this area. But I'd just like to ask, what are like the skills, the experiences, and the kind of attitudes that you want to see young people bring to the next generation who are going to kind of be tackling these sort of goals? Thank you.
So, first of all, Joe, is it? Yeah, thanks. Because I was smiling a little bit when you were talking. It reminded me of a statistic I saw earlier, which was in Canada, 70% of people coming out of college, 70 to 75% maybe, aren't interested in jobs in resources broadly. And then, and it's sort of oil and gas is number one, mining is number two, and then goes down to tech where everybody's interested in that, And it made me think about the great crisis that we have in, broadly speaking, is as an industry, is trying to find people that are interested in working in it and that can bring diversity of thought and action and alignment towards a different world. And so what you find is when you're trying to build a mining company, you look around and it's a lot of 60-year-olds and some 50-year-olds, and then it just gets smaller and smaller, and so there's no way to have people that can help learn from what's happening right now and carry that and make it better than whatever it is we're going to accomplish across the course of our careers. I would broadly say that if I could give you some advice, it is that you should remain extremely curious, particularly in the early part of your career, being curious about why things are the way they are, and you'll find that people can get stuck in thinking ruts, and your different perspective sometimes to say, well, why are you doing it that way? And amazing things happen when you ask questions about why are we doing it that way. That's kind of what's happening here, is we're saying, well, why are we doing it that way when all it takes is a little bit of effort to go from here to there, and suddenly you have this great narrative and engagement that really connects and also does things. So I would say curiosity would be, the number one thing. The other thing I would say is try to put yourself through a mentor into positions of greater responsibility than you think you're ready for, because there's a lot of people that want to support you in that. And coming into this industry at your age, you'll find that you'll have that opportunity to grow more quickly than you think you will.
I think another thing to add to that is a willingness to get dirty, because, frankly, diversity happens out there. It doesn't happen in here. And I meet a lot of people who want to work in the mining industry but aren't prepared to actually go out on a mine and spend time out there, getting to know the community, getting to, learn the language, speak to people and understand what other people want. And it's really, really easy to actually sit back in London where everything's nice and the tap gets turned on and water comes out and it's clean, to forget about what it's like for the people who live in these communities. And so, I think the challenge out there for all of us, it doesn't matter about our age or our background or anything, is that if we really want to connect with people on a journey that is about collaboration and is about delivering something that is actually beyond our minds' lives, is to try and put ourselves in a situation where we can receive that information from other people. And it is really, really difficult for people in local communities to do that when you're on the other side of the world, speaking a different language in a different context. So, being willing, being open, the curiosity, I've got to reinforce that one, Matt. That's really important. It's great.
It's also about being a translator, right? Like being able to bridge different worlds, bring different stakeholders together, and ultimately work outside of the silos that have gotten us into this challenge. So being able to bring all of the different cross-disciplinary experiences that you've had and be able to talk to older generations, younger generations, those within the mine site and beyond is going to be a really core skill set going forward.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the need to understand what each function on a mine does, to then be able to break down those silos. It's very difficult to break them down without understanding the purpose of each of those functions and what they're trying to achieve. So spend the time getting to know what the role is of the various functions so that you can then ask the questions in the appropriate places and challenge. There's a question here, and I think that'll probably be our last one.
Hi, yeah. Thank you very much for your contributions. My name's Izzy. I'm a PhD student at the University of Birmingham, and I'm doing sustainability in lithium-ion batteries, which means my questions are a bit battery heavy, so sorry. I have 2 questions for the panel. Firstly, how do you see things like nature-positive mining being embedded in things like legislation, like the battery passport that we've seen in the EU? Because that focuses on carbon emissions, but how can we change the conversation to include both aspects of the important? And also, how can we use this conversation and turn it on its head? Because you've been talking a lot about supply, and how do we bring this kind of conversation to the demand side and talk about nature positivity and needing to, mine only what we need in order to talk in Western countries about needing to lower demand? Wondering if you had any thoughts on that. Thank you.
So Izzy, I think that Matt actually hit the nail on the head on your first question earlier, which is, for me, we're seeing excellent tools like life cycle assessment now really more routinely being used for things like understanding a carbon footprint. Increasingly, people expanding that to look at what water impacts or water stewardship an operation, a business, and ultimately then a product would create. And I think now with the dawn of the TNFDs, it's only a matter of time until we start to have a biodiversity footprint element to the life cycle assessment as well. But, there's a bit of a life cycle, sorry to use the phrase again, but a bit of a process we've got to go to before we get to the point of having standardised metrics for what a biodiversity component of a life cycle assessment might look at. And even now with the TNFDs, there's still going to be that evolution of how do we actually measure what is positive, what is neutral. Even for those of us who work in this field closely, we sat there in the conversation before we came out here discussing that very point. How do we actually push this to the next step?
Yeah, Izzy, I was going to say, because you're younger than me, you're one of the questions is really a when question, because a lot of this is happening. We encourage our investee companies, encourage to get on the disclosure train, which means you don't have to be perfect, you just have to start it. And it's amazing when you start that, you start actually looking at what am I disclosing and how do I feel about that and can we do better. It becomes a journey that reveals itself and improves. And so really, from your perspective, it would be, that's great, let's speed it up, right? and some measure of impatience from your standpoint would probably be appropriate. And I think that from a legislative standpoint, it started really carbon, which is the carbon and carbon accounting was kind of the start, and the conversation really has broadened out. So from my perspective, I see that it is arriving towards the world, both from the demand and legislative side, naturally from the question that you asked. And so then that's why I turn it around into how do you accelerate that is an interesting question. It is happening. And then the question would be, can you accelerate it? And if you accelerate it from a stick rather than a carrot perspective, is it going to make it more or less effective?
Well, Andrew's here, which means he's going to kick us off the stage. So thank you very much to all my panelists for an interesting conversation and to everyone for joining us. Thank you.